So today I'm going to talk about studying health and migration using social media. And in particular, I will be focusing on combining social media data and survey methods. I know that at CPC, there is a lot of expertise on health, migration, as well as data collection. And so I'm really looking forward to having stimulating conversations with the CPC community. Now, before I start, I would like to acknowledge all the people who contributed to the work that I'm going to present today. In particular, I'm going to talk mainly about the COVID-19 health and behavior survey, which is a Facebook survey that we ran recently at the Institute at MPIDR. Daniela Perotta, Andre Gros, Emanuele Del Fava, and Jorge Cimentada are research scientists at the MPIDR. Sofia Gil is a PhD student at the Institute. Francesco Rampazzo, that many of you probably know, was a PhD student at the University of Southampton at the time, and he was also visiting the Institute when we started this project. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about the Social Trend Survey of Mexicans in the US, which is a Facebook survey that we are about to run at the Institute in collaboration with colleagues at the University of Chicago. René Flores is assistant professor of sociology at the University of Chicago. Ilana Ventura is a PhD student at the University of Chicago in the Department of Sociology. Ingmar Weber is the director for social computing at the Qatar Computing Research Institute. Andre Gros has been part of both teams and has been leading the data collection using Facebook as a tool for data collection. All right, I'm going to start this presentation with an image. So this is a picture that shows a child in front of a distorting mirror, one of those mirrors that make us look taller or shorter, wider or narrower, and that we typically find at fairs. Now, I'm showing you this image because I think that in a way, estimating demographic quantities is a little bit like trying to get the measurement of a child when all we have are distorted images. Now, all data have their own imperfections. When we have more than one sort of distorted mirror, we can triangulate those data sources, those mirrors, and we can hope to get better estimates that address the types of biases that may be different across different data sources. Social media, in a way, is a little bit like a new mirror that was added to our collection of distorted mirrors. I think of it as a sort of gift that was given to us, like gifts that we receive. They may not always be exactly what we wanted or exactly what we needed, but we can make the most out of it. So social media can be used as a source of data. But today I will also argue that social media can be used to build our own mirrors. In other words, social media can be used as a tool for data collection. In particular, I'm going to discuss ways in which the Facebook advertising platform can be used for demographic research. Facebook has like the main business of Facebook relies on advertisements. And so Facebook has made it relatively easy for people to create advertisement campaigns. Say if you want to create some ads on Facebook, what you have to do is to go on facebook.com/business. There you can click on create an ad, and then you will be shown a web interface that looks a little bit like this one. For this example, I chose people who say are living in New York City, all age groups, all genders, and with the characteristics that they used to live in the UK. So essentially, UK expats in New York City. So if I do this, then Facebook tells me that there are about 23,000 users, Facebook users, who match these criteria. We can change the criteria. We can select people who are interested in something specific, people who are interested in a specific type of food, in a specific type of music, people who have different types of characteristics, and Facebook will give us their estimate of the number of users that match those targeting specifications. These types of data are typically used by marketers as they sort of make some decisions on budgets for campaigns. But this data can also be used by demographers, as essentially they are a mini census of the Facebook population of its users. This data can be downloaded for free, and it can be downloaded in a programmatic way. So that makes things relatively easy. Now, we can also go one step further, and we can actually create an ad campaign. So essentially, we can produce an advertisement that would look like this on someone's Facebook feed, for example. So this ad can be shown to people with specific characteristics. For example, it can be targeted to men or to women or to people in different age groups or in a specific region and so on. When people see this type of ad, then they can decide whether they want to click on it or not. And if they do click on it, then they are redirected to an external page that is not part of Facebook. In this case, is a page on the MPIDR servers, where people can fill out a survey questionnaire. In this case, it was the health behavior survey. Okay, so for this presentation, here is the outline. First, I'll give you a little bit of background and motivation for these types of studies and for the need of Facebook surveys. Then I will go into the COVID-19 health and behavior survey, and we'll discuss some of the methods and initial results. And finally, I will talk about this survey that is coming up, the social trend survey of Mexican immigrants in the US. So I'm going to start with some background and motivation. I'm going to show you some examples of uses of Facebook data to study migration. This will give you a little bit of background on how this already prepared data can be used for migration, but I will also show some of the limitations of this data and the need to sort of collect additional data via surveys. I'm going to start with an example of migrants to US states for different countries of origin. So in this figure, you see on the y-axis the fraction of foreign-born according to the American Community Survey in the US, and on the x-axis, essentially the equivalent category estimated by Facebook. Each data point is a combination of country of origin and US state of destination, say Mexicans in New Mexico, Mexicans in California, Filipinos in Hawaii, and so on. The red dashed line is the 45-degree line, and the same data are also shown on a log-law scale in the inset. So this figure essentially shows that there are strong correlations between what Facebook estimates in terms of migrants based on the Facebook population and what we get from the American Community Survey. Now, if we were to sort of disaggregate this by age, sex, and other characteristics, we will see that a number of biases emerge. But these initial findings showed that there is signal in this data, and there is also a need to understand some of these biases. And so this initial study led to a number of other papers on how to understand the biases in Facebook data and how to correct for them in order to make some inference about migration measurements. Let me give you a second example. A little over 3 years ago, Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico with the destructive consequences that we're all aware of. Normally, we would use the American Community Survey to assess the impact of the hurricane on both short-term and long-term migration to US states. However, at the time, the US Census Bureau warned us that the American Community Survey was not really suitable for the task, because in part of the timing of data collection for the survey, and also because of residence requirements in order to be included in the survey. So what we did was that we used Facebook data and a difference in difference approach to estimate both short-term migration and return migration to the US. We estimated that about 180,000 people left the island in the 3 months after the hurricane hit. They went mostly to Florida and to states in the Northeast. And about a third of them either returned to Puerto Rico or moved to other states in the US in the early months of 2018. Now, we produced these estimates in close collaboration with the Migration Office at the Census Bureau, which also validated the values with flight passenger data. In addition to that, Facebook data also includes information by age and sex, so estimates by age and sex could be produced. These estimates are particularly important to understand migration processes, in particular in the aftermath of a disaster, but they're also important to understand other demographic phenomena, like mortality. So for example, if we need to produce mortality rates, we need the denominators, that is population counts, that are highly affected by migration. And so this type of data can help us produce more accurate sort of denominators for demographic rates. So following up on this study, we developed a new Bayesian approach to combine survey data and social media data within a solid statistical framework in order, for example, to nowcast migration. In a recent paper, we showed that a model that combines both sources, say Facebook and the ACS, performs better than a model that uses either one or the other when it comes to nowcasting. And so we used that approach in order to produce nowcasts of migrant stocks across US states. And we plan to use and to refine these methods in order to understand the differential impact of discontinuities like the current COVID-19 pandemic on migration to the US. So far, I've given you examples about counting people. Now I would like to sort of switch slightly and also give you an example of how we can use Facebook data, in particular Facebook data related to interest, in order to assess processes of assimilation and integration. Here is an example of how we use interest revealed from the Facebook advertising platform to assess assimilation of Mexicans in the US when considering musical taste as a cultural marker. These charts are two pseudo maps of the US. They show how they compare Mexican immigrants with the Anglo population, essentially the white non-Hispanic population on the left-hand side, and Mexican immigrants with the African American population on the right-hand side. Lighter color in this map indicate higher assimilation, still based on musical preferences as revealed by Facebook. So we see that there is quite a bit of heterogeneity across states in both maps. But one thing that is clear is that if we look at the average color, so the map on the right tends to be lighter than the map on the left, indicating that still within the type of context that we have, that is the one of Facebook data, Mexican immigrants tend to assimilate more to African Americans than to the Anglo population. And so this would support the view of a segmented type of assimilation rather than a linear type of assimilation. Now, these results were obtained using passively collected information, which have their own imperfections. So for example, we don't know how long migrants had been into the country, or we don't know the characteristics of family members, for example. So to address this and also related issues, like the fact that we don't know exactly how Facebook produces estimates for interest, we plan to run an online survey where respondents are recruited via Facebook advertisements. The idea is that this would enable us to validate our results from passively collected data. So for example, if we show ads to migrants who, according to Facebook, are interested in salsa music, and then we ask them what type of music they like via a survey, we can assess the quality of the estimates produced by Facebook. Moreover, we can also ask a number of additional questions to gather information that typically we can't simply get from passively collected data on social media, including information about family members or the time that they've spent in the country. So that was the plan, but there are plans and there are also pandemics. So the original plan was to validate Facebook data and enhance them via a Facebook survey of Mexicans in the US. What happened was that at the time when we were about to run that survey, the pandemic hit. And so we had to sort of slightly update the plan. So we decided to sort of switch our energy and resources for a little while to postpone the Mexican survey and to conduct a more general survey that includes questions about health and that is related to the specific context of COVID-19. So I'm now going to tell you a little bit more about this survey, the COVID-19 Health and Behavior Survey, including some methods and initial results. So here is a general overview of the survey. Respondents were recruited via Facebook advertisements. In other words, respondents were shown advertisements that look a little bit like this one. Those who clicked were redirected to a website where they filled a survey questionnaire. The questionnaire included questions about sociodemographic characteristics, about health indicators, behaviors and attitudes, as well as social contacts. Once these data were collected, they went through post-stratification using data from Eurostat and the US Census in order to correct for biases in observable characteristics. After this post-stratification process that led to the production of weights, we produce estimates of behavioral change across countries. And this is just an example related, for example, to wearing face masks. So the survey covered 8 countries: Belgium, Germany, Spain, France, Italy, the Netherlands, the UK, and the US, and was continuously run between March 13 and August 12, so for a period of 5 months, even though for a few countries we had to start a few weeks later than March 13. Now, given the nature of the survey, which was online, we were able to start fairly quickly at the onset of the pandemic, and also to run continuously for several months. So that led to a sizable sample size with about 144,000 completed questionnaires. An important feature of this survey was that we used targeted advertisements. So that enabled us to have a balanced sample of respondents across various types of demographic groups and region. For each country, there was one campaign that was run. For each campaign, there were various ad sets that reflected different stratifications that we use. We included strata that were produced based on the sex of the respondents, the age, and the region of residence. And then within each ad set, people were shown an image. They were shown an ad that looks like this, but there were 6 different options. And these are the types of images that people were shown in the ads. The response rate, as measured by the percentage of Facebook users who completed the questionnaire after clicking on the ad, was generally reasonable, but we also observed some variability. So for example, Spain was a bit of an outlier in terms of response rate, as we observed significantly lower response rates than in other countries. We also observed that on average, women tended to have higher response rates than men. But overall, we were able to balance using our targeting advertising approach. So after the data had been collected, we made adjustments in order to produce a closer approximation to a representative sample. And in particular, we use post-stratification weighting. So what we did is that we assigned weights to respondents in each stratum of the survey. And the weights were produced by taking the fraction of the proportion of individuals who belong in stratum I in the general population, say based on Eurostat data or based on census data. And we divided that by the proportion of respondents who belong to stratum I in the survey. So essentially, those groups that are, this was done in order to correct for underrepresentation or overrepresentation of certain groups in the survey. Now let me show you a few results now. I'll give you some examples related to perception of threat. This chart, if we focus on panel A, shows perception of threat to different groups, to oneself, to the family, to the local community, to the country, or the world. On the y-axis, we have the perception of threat for women, and on the x-axis for men. And this is a 45-degree line. Now, if we look at this, we see that most of the data points lie above the 45-degree line, indicating that on average, women are more concerned across all dimensions. The colors indicate whether people are more concerned to oneself or the family or the country or the world. So blue lines are oneself and the family, red and orange line, the country and the world. We see a gradient here. So the threat perception increases from a personal sphere to more distal context. The size of the dots indicate age groups, with the smaller dots indicating the youngest age group and the largest dot indicating 65 plus. So here we see that across all dimensions, younger people tend to be less concerned about COVID-19. Now, panel B has a similar type of setting, but we have the perception of threat with respect to family and with respect to oneself. The colors here indicate age groups. Green are the younger age groups, yellow and red, the older age groups. So we see that for the older age groups, people are equally concerned for the family and for themselves. Whereas for younger age groups, they tend to be concerned more for the family than for themselves. Panel C shows the perception of threat to the world or to the country. So these are sort of more distal context. In this case, we see that there's no significant difference. People who tend to be concerned for the country also tend to be concerned for the world. But we do see that younger people tend to be less concerned, and that yeah, even though sort of there is an equal threat nationally and globally. So this is an example about perception of threat. Now I would like to show you an example related to social contacts. This figure shows the average number of daily contacts over time. The dotted line indicates the date in which the physical distancing guidelines were introduced at the national level, whereas the dashed line indicates the date in which partial or full lockdown measures were implemented in different countries. Now, if we take a look at the UK and the US, so for the UK and the US, we have data that started before physical distancing guidelines were issued. We see that the number of contacts, that's like the overall number of contacts, that's the red line, indicated that people had on a daily basis an average of 6 contacts per day. And by contacts, I mean a conversation in presence of someone else that includes 2 or more words, or physical contact, including hugging, shaking hands, kissing, and so on. After the introduction of physical distancing guidelines, contacts went down fairly quickly in the US and in the UK, and they reached levels slightly above 3. After lockdown measures were introduced, the number of contacts went down further, but relatively speaking, not as much as before. So the number of contacts went down to levels below 3, but the largest sort of decrease in contacts had already happened after physical distancing issues were physical distancing guidelines were issued. If we look at countries like the Netherlands and Germany, where lockdown measures were not as strict as in other countries where we can think of sort of partial lockdown measures, the number of contacts stayed a little bit higher and ranged in the area of 4 contacts per day per people. Now, if we want to get a sense of patterns by age, this figure shows how contacts for different age groups change over time. The red line indicates the youngest age group, 18 to 24, and the dashed purple line indicates 65 plus. So one thing that we observed across all countries is that older people tended to have much fewer contacts than younger people across countries. This could be interpreted as a protective measure of relatively older people, and it could also potentially be related to differential perception of threat across different demographic groups in the population. All right, so now let me return to a broader initial question related to the validity of the information that Facebook data provides us and makes available via the Facebook advertising platform. We want to know whether Facebook correctly classifies users' actual characteristics. And we can do that using the data that we collected in the survey. I'll give you an example. This is a table that shows the fraction of all classifications that are correct by sex, age, and geographic region. So let's take, for example, the United Kingdom, and for sex, the value is 0.99, 99%. So this means that whenever we target someone on Facebook in the United Kingdom by sex, say if we target women and then we ask them to fill out the questionnaire. In 99% of the cases, they will report that they are women. So Facebook classification by sex is pretty accurate, and that is consistent across countries. Facebook's classification by age group is slightly less accurate, but still fairly accurate, above 90% across countries, with some variability. When we look at geographic region, we see that for most countries, that's also fairly accurate, with a couple of exceptions that are Belgium and the United Kingdom. So what we did was that we looked more closely at those cases. This table shows the fraction of all classifications as a specific region that are correct. We see that in most countries, this fraction was bigger than 90% across all sub-regions of the country, except for Belgium and the UK, which have a couple of regions that show lower levels of precision at around 66%. These are London in the UK and Brussels in Belgium. So when we looked a little bit more closely at that, here is an example of Belgium and Brussels. So essentially what we saw was that the misclassifications for Brussels are mostly related to people who live in adjacent regions. So for example, people who live in Flanders and Wallonia tend to be classified as people who live in Brussels, and this is incorrect. So overall, what we concluded was that at the country level, geographic classification is highly accurate, which is valuable for studies of international migration. Within countries, there could be circumstances where there is a big city and nearby regions where there is a bit of confounding, especially if people report living in a city or there are commuting patterns from the city to the nearby regions. All right, so let me now tell you a little bit about what is coming up, which is this social trend survey of Mexican immigrants in the US. So this is something that we are not running yet. We are at a sort of testing phase, and we hope to be able to run this survey within the next few weeks. Now, if you are shown an ad to participate in this survey, you will then be redirected to a study page that looks a little bit like this. The survey is going to be run in English and Spanish. Those are the two main languages of the survey. The main goal is to understand social and cultural patterns among people living in the US and their families in Mexico. Now, a key aspect of this survey is that we want to understand how sort of social cultural patterns differ between family members. And so in addition to targeting people via Facebook, those who respond to the survey and those who participate in the study are asked to invite other members of their family to participate in the study. This could be adult children or their parents, and they could be living in Mexico or living in the US. People will be able to do so via a link that can be shared either via email or WhatsApp, depending on whether people participate in the survey using their cell phone or their computer. And so that way, we hope to be able to link information from family members and respondents in order to get a better understanding of patterns of assimilation and integration, in this case, for the US context and for Mexican. Now, this survey will include a number of questions about respondents and their families, about music preferences, which is related to our initial goal to validate Facebook data and understand whether passively collected information from Facebook is actually consistent with what you get from a survey. We will ask questions about languages, friendships, health, views on the COVID pandemic or implications of the COVID pandemics for their life, political participation, experience with discrimination, immigration attitudes, work situation, and a number of demographic characteristics. Now, I'm not going to go deep into this, but I just want to give you a bit of an overview of this project that is coming up. The design in general is going to be quite similar to the one of the COVID-19 health behavior survey. So if you see some issues or if you have some sort of comments on how to improve that, those would be most welcome. Now, one other thing, if in the next few weeks you are in the UK and you see an ad that asks you to participate in this specific survey where we're targeting Mexicans in the US, please also let me know, because that probably means that something went completely wrong with our targeting specifications. So I started this presentation with an image, and I would like to end also with an image. These are images from the Hubble telescope before and after corrective optics. So the Hubble telescope was launched in 1990, but there were some issues. Essentially, its main mirror had been ground incorrectly, and so there were flaws that led to sort of compromise capabilities. So the first types of pictures that came back to Earth looked like this one, like the one on the left. So these are sort of blurry. They are not exactly what scientists expected. They were still better than pictures that could be obtained from Earth-based telescopes, and so they led to discoveries among astronomers. But they didn't reach the level of accuracy that was expected. After the problem was fixed, images became sharper, and so we got images like the one on the right, and that led to much more accurate measurements. And so I hope that I at least partially convince you that we are in a similar situation with social media. What we have at the moment are quite blurry images that are still helpful, but they are not the best that we can get. And at the moment, we are at an exciting phase where we can sort of develop corrective optics and get sharper images of our society. So this is an exciting time to work on these topics. Okay, with this, I conclude. I would like to thank you again for your attention, also on behalf of all the people who contributed to this work. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments from you.